Doesn't matter. All right, so whew, um, this is our session on transplant and diversion. And unlike other sessions, we only have an hour for this one. So we're going to cook along pretty quickly here. I want to do some brief introductions to get started. And I'm actually going to, where's my mic up here? So I asked everyone to give me a bio sketch, but I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just introduce themselves briefly rather than reading through your bios. So if you just tell me your name and whether you have had a diversion or a transplant or both. I know in one case we have both, right? And just kind of how your experience has been here so far.
At the symposium?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right, whoa, that's really loud. I'm Brianna, and I had a liver transplant my senior year of high school when I was 17 years old, and it went really well. And this is my sixth symposium that I've been to, and so far I am loving it, like all the other ones, so.
I'm Hannah. I've had both a diversion and transplant. My diversion was when I was 6, and my transplant, a liver transplant, I was 13. So, and this is my 4th symposium, and so far it's been pretty fun.
I'm Ruben Quiros. I'm a transplant hepatologist and a liver doctor, and has been part of, I will say, allergy community for 20 years. I will say since I started my research back when I was a fellow. And I don't do a lot of research on allergy right now. I just take care of patients, and I've been involved with the Alliance now for over 10 years, I think 15 years probably, has been a little while. This is my 4th symposium, and it's always fun to come. I will say that having the opportunity to listen to the patient's perspective and the parent's perspective change you as a doctor. I mean, I also come here to learn, to be quite honest.
Great. Okay, so we're going to do just a really quick question here. So is there anybody in the room whose child has had a diversion? Either external to internal? Okay. And then what about transplant? Do we have anybody in here who's transplant? Okay. So I'm going to flip through a few of these. We've all heard a bunch about the liver. I think we know a lot about the liver. And I'm going to cut to the chase here. Yep, stores stuff. You can't live without it. We know that in Alagille syndrome, you can have various liver disease. It can go from really mild to really severe. And we're all concerned about bile. All right, so I was going to tackle diversion first. And there are a couple different types of diversion. One is the partial external biliary diversion, which is called a cholecystojejunostomy. Say that 3 times fast. And I'm going to ask Ruben to just give us a quick rundown on what an external biliary diversion is.
Yeah, you can see basically the picture there, but what you want to accomplish is that you want to have some of that bile drain from the gallbladder, the green structure in the middle of the slide, to one limb of jejunum, and that's usually about 10 centimeters or so, a little bit, or 10 to 20 centimeters. Try to make it shorter. That goes outside. You can see the picture to your right that there is a communication sign, and then on the left you see the actual picture how it's going to look like. You want to somehow, this is going to, you drain about a couple of ounces is enough a day to improve itching. Usually the main reason why you will do this is for what we call pruritus or itching, and you can have a secondary gain, which is the xanthomas can go away as well. But the theory behind is what we have been talking about over the past couple of days is bile acid. Losing that extra bile acid that cannot be drained, it forces your liver to produce more and eventually also get rid of that accumulation sometimes that lead to itching.
Okay. And then the other type of diversion, well, this is just kind of a quick external diversion fact. So it diverts about 30 to 50% of the bile, helps control cholestasis, helps with itching, slows cirrhosis or scarring of the liver, and it's effective in about 75% of patients. And there are really relatively few long-term complications that are reported with the external diversion. And it's an alternative to liver transplant, or at least it will extend the life of your liver. And in some cases, you will end up with a transplant, but you'll gain some years with your own liver. All right, and then we have internal biliary diversion. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. And another illustration here. And again, if Ruben, you could kind of describe this as opposed to the external diversion.
Then the internal, basically, you're not going to have that little hole that comes on your right side that we saw in the picture before. What you try to do on this procedure is to bypass that very last part of the small bowel. We call it terminal ileum. Then your small bowel comes all the way from your stomach, start what we call the duodenum. The very first part goes through the jejunum. A lot of absorption happens there. And then at the end, you have the ileum right before you get into the large bowel or the colon. In that very last segment of the ileum or a small bowel is where all the absorption of bile acids happen again and goes back into, it has a name in medicine, we call it enterohepatic circulation of the bile. Then the bile acid comes back into the liver. By you bypassing that very last portion, there are 2 different techniques, surgical techniques that they use to do this, but basically the main principle is you bypass that very last part of the small bowel. In that way, you prevent the absorption of bile acid, and then the bile acids goes out through the poop because now it's not absorbed. Then in principle, you are draining bile acids basically through both procedures. The nice thing about this one is you don't have a ostomy bag here, or you don't have something in your belly. Basically, you don't realize that you have, you see that person doesn't have to, you don't have to worry about draining up a bile or doing certain things on the daily basis. Mm-hmm. Disadvantages, some people say may predispose you to diarrhea more than the other procedure. Also absorptions, malabsorption of certain things that depend upon bile acid may happen a little bit more frequent than the other one, but there are ways to bypass that or treat that medically.
Now there's kind of are there two different types of internal diversion?
Yeah, that's one type where you the part put in red is the part that you don't want bile to go through to prevent absorption. Then that's completely disconnect from the other part that you see a little bit above. And then it's connected directly to the colon. Then you are bypassing. That's one way to do it.
So just kind of a quickie on the internal diversion. So, prevents reabsorption of bile, helps control cholestasis, similar to the external, slows the scarring, but you don't have a bag. You don't have the ostomy, you have no bag. And in about 50% of patients, there is a return of itching, even after the procedure has been done. And again, it's an alternative to liver transplant. So, Hannah, you have had both a diversion and a transplant. Could you tell us a little bit about your diversion, when it was done, how long it lasted before you had transplant, things like that?
Yeah, I had a internal biliary diversion when I was 6, and that lasted until it helped with itching, and it got rid of with a lot of the xanthomas. And then that lasted until I was about like 10, and then it started like picking back up again. My liver was failing dramatically, and my itching increased a ton, and then they put me on the transplant list. So then I got a transplant when I was 13. So.
And Ruben, can you tell us a little bit about, how do you make a decision about a diversion, and deciding between doing an external or an internal diversion?
Okay. Yes. I think for the diversion, the main thing basically should be that you have run down all the list of medications that we use for itching, and you did not get any improvement. Because at the end of the day, if a medication take care of the itching, I think you prevent a surgery. Then that can happen in some instances, not all, but some instances. But you have to ensure that you have tried all these different medications. And nowadays, hopefully, we'll have in the future certain medications that may help as well and could prevent for you to need a surgery. But once you have a severe itching that has not improved with medication, then I think that's where diversion comes into mind, to go into that procedure. I think between external and internal, personally, I will have that conversation with the patient or the parents and try to decide. Some kids, they don't want to have a hole in their abdomen at all, and then I think you can see the numbers. I think they are pretty similar in what you want to accomplish. There's a little bit more recurrency of it with the internal than with the external. But I don't think there's enough difference to say this is going to be better than the other one. I think it's more of a preference of which one you want to do based upon the differences that they are. And I think the more obvious one that I find patients making a decision point is, again, going back to having a back here versus not having it. In regard to a diversion versus a transplant, I think if the itching is very bad and you have very well established end-stage liver disease, there's the potential to consider this is a time to do a transplant, just based upon that. I would say if you have severe liver disease, that would be good, because the liver transplant could take care of the itching, obviously not without his issues also. But I think one consideration in my mind is that I will do a diversion without hesitating in someone that doesn't have cirrhosis. What we call cirrhosis, when the liver is completely scarred down. If the patient doesn't have it, even if it has some fibrosis, it can delay the process. It can push you into transplant. It can give you a few years. I will do it. When I will probably have at least a conversation about the transplant is if the patient has cirrhosis and potential complications for cirrhosis, with the itching just being part of it, then I will probably have that conversation about transplant at that given time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you talk a little bit more about, why you would do a liver transplant.
Yeah. I think um, first we have to um, be honest and say, when you do a liver transplant, you basically are trading one disease process for another disease process that, or I put a disease, but for another process that can give you problems. Then you have to be clear that the likelihood of someone to be here with us in 5, 10 years is better if you do the transplant than if you don't. That's one good piece to it, because transplant is not without its complications. Transplant is not without its issue. You know, you have to take medication every day. You gotta go through that process of, you know, it's still certain things do not go away. It's not like everything you just do the transplant and everything goes away and you don't have to worry about anything else. Then I think that's the first thing that you want to have clear in your mind and in your conversation. You want to also understand, again, going back to survival, the likelihood of someone having it's such a bad liver disease that actually it will impact the survival over the next few years. Then if I don't do this patient or this person can have problems severe enough to limit their life span. Then I think because you want to be sure of that, because if something bad happened, you want to be sure you go back and understand why you got there. You know, you were really trying to benefit the patient with the transplant. The reasons to do a transplant is when you reach the point where we call end-stage liver disease. The end-stage liver disease basically is when your liver is scarred down really badly, sometimes starts shrinking down, but then as your liver is all scarred down, you start having complications from it. You start having portal hypertension, esophageal varices. What are those things? The pressure in the portal vein, which is the vein that goes through the liver, start getting higher because your liver is hard to go through. Then that causes a backflow that goes into vessels that are small and then start becoming large. And when that happens, for instance, the patient could have bleeding episodes. They start vomiting blood, they start seeing black stools because some of those veins start popping into your food pipe, into your stomach. Also, sometimes there's this enlargement that can lead to GI bleed. Can also lead to toxicity, encephalopathy, issues with feeling tired, because the liver again is one of the main functions is to get rid of toxins. Normal stuff that is produced in your body gets your liver get rid of, but those things, even though are produced in your body, can become toxic to your own organs. Then the liver is supposed to take care of that. Then sometimes patients develop ascites, accumulation of fluid inside the abdomen also. They start having more failing to thrive, not growing well. Itching become worse. Keeping the patient nourished become a real challenge because now the malabsorption is worse because before there was not enough bile getting into the small bowel. Now there's none because now your liver is in bad shape. Then that when you get to the point that the liver is not working the way it should be working and having complications from it, because sometimes you can have cirrhosis but being compensated, and then that can last a few years and doesn't mean necessarily that you have to go to a list or being transplanted. Again, you had to put in perspective not only the fact that there is end-stage liver disease, but also there are complications from that end-stage liver disease.
And so for Brianna and Hannah, can you talk just a little bit about what kinds of things you were experiencing leading up to your transplant?
Well, leading up to my transplant, things were not going well at all. I got to a point where I was in so much pain, like in my hips, that I could barely walk across like a kitchen floor without having severe pain. I started getting really, really tired. Also, the fog got worse. I described it to my friends and my mom as if you have like one of those really vivid dreams where it's so real, you're walking in your dream, but everything around you is kind of foggy. That was my reality. That was my life. Oh my gosh, so much went downhill. With that, I also started losing my ability to memorize. Like, I always had a hard time memorizing stuff. And in ninth grade, was when it started to get really bad. I would fill out, like, for example, I would fill out a study sheet for my test, and I would fill it all out, and I would give it to my mom to quiz me, and I would remember nothing on the study guide. And my mom would look at me and she's like, "How did you fill this out? Did you fill this out?" And I said, "Yeah, I filled it out. I don't know." I don't know. And then in 10th grade, it got a lot worse. I've done theater since I was in kindergarten, so I was really good at memorizing lines, and that is when I started to worry because I started losing my ability to memorize lines, and I couldn't understand what was wrong with me, and I just felt so bad about myself. But I started losing my ability, and then when I told my mom, I didn't share any of this with my mom until after my transplant, but she thinks I was on the verge of hallucinating because I remember I was also really isolated because I started having nosebleeds every day. And so it's pretty sad, I actually stopped laughing, hanging out with my friends. I could not cry because I would get a nosebleed. Every time I laughed or I cried, my nose would bleed. So I didn't like laughing, I didn't like crying, and I would just get random nosebleeds that would last forever. So I pretty much isolated myself off, and that kind of led, I guess, to what, I'm going to talk about my almost hallucinations, is that, I had like I remember having this like little fairy person, and I remember one day I was in the bathroom, and she was like, "Oh, pretty soon you're going to be able to see me, Brianna, it's okay, you're going to be able to see me soon, and I'm going to be there for you." And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is really bad. And I had a really good connection with my old liver. It sounds weird, but I talked to it. I had conversations with it all the time. I was like, oh, it's okay. But I was like, oh my God, it's time. It's time now. And that's pretty much when I went to my doctor's, my GI doctor, and he did his usual thing, oh, it's gonna be okay, and I have this I had a whole speech, I had a breakdown, I said, no, it's not gonna be okay, this is it, I cannot do this anymore, I am on the last, I have no hope. I started not taking my medicine because it was like, this isn't helping me. I saw my liver transplant as like the only hope to save my life, really, because my quality of life was so bad. I couldn't go on family vacations, and I felt so horrible and guilty because I couldn't walk anywhere, and I still have problems with the sun, but it was really bad. Before my transplant, I would just get pain all over my body in the heat, and I would just shut down. And so my quality of life was really, really bad my junior year, and that is what I told my doctor. And I said, I need transplant because that's my last hope. And they, told me you're treating one problem for another. And I said, okay, well, at least the problem might be give me some hope other than this, because I don't see any other point of living right now. And then that's when they put me on the list, and I got my transplant pretty soon after that.
So how long were you on the list?
Oh God, I was like on a couple of months, to be honest. It wasn't that long. I think it was because things were so bad, and I met with the team, and they checked me out, and they were like, yeah. And it was weird too. This is the scary thing. When my doctor said that it was gonna be okay, is that my levels looked like they were getting better. So my levels were like, oh, you're turning around, you're getting better, and I knew that no, that's not true. That's not true, and it wasn't true. Like when they pulled my liver out, because my mom was super worried. When I was in surgery, she was super worried that it wasn't time and it wasn't ready. And they pulled my liver out, and I guess the surgeon came up to her and he said, "Wow, that we're glad we did this in this time because that is the worst liver I have ever seen doing this job." And I got to see my liver, and whew, it was green. It looked like an overripe avocado. It was like green and bumpy. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I'm glad, but yeah, definitely leading up to that, it was bad.
And how about you, Hannah?
I was listed in 2 different hospitals. I was listed in Cincinnati Children's Medical Center, and then I was also listed in St. Louis Children's Hospital. And I was put on the transplant list when I was 11, and so I was on the list for 2.5 years. And after my diversion, after like a few years after, when everything started picking back up, you notice that you kind of backtrack a little bit. Like you can't keep up with your friends, you can't keep up with schoolwork. So you backtrack in development, I guess is kind of the word for it. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you kind of said all of it. I mean, you kind of get to the point where you're kind of just hoping that you get one. I was denied 2 livers. So once after like the second one I got denied, I was kind of like, well, this isn't probably happening anytime soon. And then I actually, I was on a TPN and lipid drip, and I was having a really bad allergic reaction to that. And I was like, well, this is just the icing on the cake. Let me just hurt myself a little more. And I was in the hospital because I had like 105 fever from the medication they were giving me. And I got like a liver actually in the hospital I was in that night. So that was kind of nice. I was already there. So, I don't know.
Okay, so I wanted to have Ruben talk a little bit about the different segments of the liver, and then, kind of there are a few different types of transplant. If you could tell us something about those.
Then, as you can see, the liver is divided in different segments, which is something that was described early on, but it becomes helpful for treatment of different things. Become helpful for when you try to deal with a liver tumor, because you can take certain lobes depending upon where the tumor is, and you can resect that. And something that happened with the liver is that it's a very generous organ. If you take a piece of the liver, let's say you see those segment 2 and 3, they call it, and 4, but let's take those 2, 3, and 4, they're like 40% of your liver. Your liver is about 2% of your body weight. Then your liver volume, the shape is not going to go back to the way it was, but the volume of the liver is going to go back to maintain that proportion of 2% of your weight. Then the mass of the liver grows if you do that. Why I mention that is because it's an important concept when you are going to do liver transplant. There are different kind of liver transplants, but the ones that we use in pediatrics will be that potentially you can have a age match or cadaveric donor, which is usually a branded donor for pediatrics. But basically, you get a person that donates the liver and then you can use the whole liver to be transplanted to another person. And that's one donor to one recipient kind of thing. Then later, after that was the first kind of transplant that they were done here in the States. Then after a while, there were two things that people start thinking about. One was, what about if we split the liver? What that means is, for instance, what about if you have someone that is a small baby, you just take the segment 2 and 3, because they don't need a lot, give it to the infant or give it to a child, and then the rest you give it to an adult. Remember that principle where your liver is going to go back to that proportion. And it's true for that. You can have someone that have those two segments on the right 2 and 3, and you give it to a child, keeping in mind that you don't want to give either too small of a liver because you get in trouble. Then usually the rule of thumb is that when you get close to 1% of the body weight, you don't want to go too low below that. Some people has pushed it to 0.8% of someone weight. Then you take someone that just small. You have to figure out how much of a mass it is, the weight that it is. There are formulas to figure that out, and then you put that in perspective to your recipient weight, and then you know that proportion. If you put a little bit bigger, interestingly enough, the liver adapt. What happened? It shrink down again to keep that proportion. Then that's the fact that the liver can do that help us to do these kind of things. Then what happened then, if you have a cadaveric organ, you divide it in two, you can have one donor for two recipients. Then you serve two people with one organ, which is, you cannot do it all the time. Sometimes, obviously, this anatomy change and the way you can resect it or not, but that's another way to approach it. Then the other one, and the last one, will be what we call living related. Then a person that is alive and related or not related, or living donor, basically. We don't say too much living related because it could be, you don't have to be related to the patient. Then the way it works is that the way it started is with segment 2 and 3, you give it, you kind of wait, you have all these ways to analyze the mass of that liver through imaging studies. You can use MRIs or CT scans, and there are all this software that figured out this is potentially the weight that you are going to get out of these two segments, and ensuring that is a good donor, is a healthy person, whatever. Then you can take those two segments and give it to a kid, keeping that in mind, the proportion I talked about initially. Then if you have someone that doesn't weigh a lot, that way of that liver keep that proportion that I talk about, then you can give those two segments to a kid. And what happened then, again, as I mentioned before, those segments are going to grow and keep that proportion. And there are reports in Japan that has been doing this probably the longest, but there are reports of livers that have been there for 20 something years, segment. Because you always wonder, will this be enough for a lifespan or not? This liver remain with the appropriate volume for all those years because it keep on growing. Nowadays, we are getting more sophisticated. Now, they are using living donors for adult patients. Again, you have to keep in mind the proportion, but they are using now to the left side of your screen. Sometimes you can take the whole right segment, which is 7, 6, 5, 6, 7, 8. That will be to your left. Or, depending upon the side, you can do 4, 2, 3, and 4, one or the other. Keeping in mind that you cannot leave the person. That proportion is going to be crucial. Whenever you do any of these things, you have to keep in mind the mass, the weight of the patient, ensure that you are not going to cause problems when you do this kind of surgery. But that's how much has advanced in regard to the different techniques that you may have to offer a patient a transplant.
Okay, I'm going to breeze through this really quickly. So United Network for Organ Sharing, they are the national organization that coordinates organ donation in the U.S. and they have everybody, they allocate organs to different regions. And then I also wanted to talk about MELD versus PELD. If you can tell us what those are, Ruben. And
Okay. The way transplant has evolved, it started in the late 80s, all the way up to now. I mean, obviously, we are talking about now about 30 years or so. At the beginning, this the allocation, what we call allocation of the organs, will be based upon who screams louder, which center asks for this in a louder, better way, advocate for the patient better, saying that my patient is going to die if I don't do this. And there was too much subjectivity to it, too much. And then in 2002, after many, many years of analyzing data and everything, they came with a system of how to give a number to your likelihood of dying over the next 3 or 6 months, or so forth. Then, based upon that likelihood, based upon that large database that in adults they have, in pediatric we have, we came up with certain labs that will give us a value to it. The MELT use albumin, INR, and creatinine, which is creatinine is a measure of a kidney function, but is impacted by the liver, while the PEL use albumin, INR, and bili. I'm sorry, the MEL doesn't use albumin. MEL use INR, bili, and creatinine. In pediatric, the PELs use albumin, INR, and bili. Then we don't use, the creatinine is the one that changes. Albumin is not used in adults, and creatinine is not used in kids. And that gives you, there's a formula for that. To get up, you put the lab value, multiply for certain factors, and that gives you a number. There's a formula for that. Then for the PEL, you get certain points if your kid is failing to thrive, or if the patient is less than 1 year. Then the PEL, that will give you certain points. That will increase your number. Then for both, the higher your number, the higher the likelihood of dying over the next 3 months or so. Then what happened with this is it make it objective. The MEL, when obviously we implemented this in 2002, then we have gone back and analyzed what happened and since we implemented. The MEL, after 3 or 4 years, we realized that the MEL score is a little bit better than the PEL score. The ones used in adults is better than the one used in pediatrics. Then, after that analysis, it was decided that we should use the MEL actually in kids older than 12. Before, PELS was used up to 18 years. But now, that's why now they talk about 12 years. Because they believe was that under 12, then it wasn't proven that was better. And this was done through analysis with patients and applying the MEL and see how much they correlate. Now, the good thing about this is that he has given us make something subjective, a little bit objective, giving you a number, you know where you are in the list, I mean, it's not perfect, unfortunately. The PELs have more issues. I'm sorry, the PEL is the PELD. That one we have more issues because when we look at, now we are analyzing, we are looking at how many patients has been transplanted without using the actual PEL. What that means is that 60% about of the patient or more has been transplanted without using the actual PEL, the calculated PEL. Then what that means is that most patients, the majority of patients, you basically most of the time will write a special letter to ask for an exception because the perception for most of us when we do this and we get the score after we calculate this number is that doesn't reflect how sick the patient is. Then right now, UNOS is looking into how can we make this better? How can we improve that? How can we change that? But we are now in the process of analyzing that and try to figure out what is the best way to do this. But this is just a way to try to prioritize who you transplant first.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to leave enough time for you guys to ask some questions. But I do want to ask Hannah and Brianna how things have been post-transplant for you.
Things have been a lot better, obviously. Right after transplant, it literally, my mom said it literally took like an hour, and she noticed a complete difference in the color of my skin. You know, I was completely jaundiced. My eyes were completely jaundiced, and she said I had like a normal skin tone, like an hour after surgery. And then I was only in the hospital for like a couple weeks, and then I was discharged, and I had my transplant in Cincinnati, and I stayed in Cincinnati for a few months after that. And then I was able to go home to Louisville, Kentucky. And then I graduated on time with my class, so I was able to keep up with schoolwork the entire time. I was out of school that entire year, my entire 7th grade year. I did homeschooling and schooling at the hospital, and so I was able to keep up. And I graduated with everybody I went to school with, and grade school and all that. And I was able to go to college on time, and so I'm able to do everything. Before I would get out of breath really quickly, and now I like hike like almost every week. So.
Have you had any problems with rejection or complications?
Yeah, I think I was good for like 2 years, and then I had I rejected twice, and they were both like acute rejection, so they were able to turn it around. And I was in the hospital for maybe like a week, and they just altered my medicine a little bit and flipped it around, and I was perfectly fine after that.
Things, I know, right? Things are a lot better after my transplant. Woo! I felt like I was reborn, to be honest. And like Hannah said, my mom noticed that my color changed. I got pink like an hour after my transplant. Like my eyes started to not be yellow, or my skin. That was really cool. But oh my gosh, so much is different. I'm so thankful and blessed to have this liver, and I haven't had any rejection signs yet. Just knock on the wood for me. Okay. I can walk now. I can go on trips with my parents. Like I said, the sun still gives me some problems, but I think that's mainly to do with my heart and my like vascular system, not my liver. But it's not as bad. Like I get the achy skin, but it's not like it's not as bad pain as it was before my transplant. So I can walk. I am growing muscle now. Like I have calves. It's awesome. I'm like, oh yeah, baby, okay. I have muscle now. I was like, I have never been able to have muscle in my entire life. I got muscle. I can squat now, kind of, and get back up. Oh, it's really cool. Yeah, I have more energy, and I can see things. Like my world is clear for once. I can notice birds in the sky, and the sky is clear, and it's not like I'm not living in a fuzzy dream world anymore. I can taste my food now. I discovered everything. I haven't discovered anything that I don't like, because I've been trying new food. I went on an adventure. Oh, I remember my first meal out of transplant was like chicken noodle soup and french fries. It was really, really cool, because I remember like tasting like the first taste of chicken noodle soup Like, it might sound boring, but it was like fireworks in my mouth. Like, I could feel the soup like soak into my tongue. It was awesome. So I love food. And I tried chocolate. Chocolate's good now. Oh my gosh. And I don't put steak on like the soak cycle anymore. It's like I can eat it and chew it, and it's not like I'm just chewing on some weird rubber. So like food's an adventure. I can see things. Like, oh my god, so much is better. Like I cannot. It's there's so much. Like you can come ask me, and I will have a new thing. Like even personal things like bathroom habits are much different. Like I can go into it. Like before my transplant, like allergies, you have like the diarrhea, and you basically like. Before my transplant, I had to go to the bathroom. Like I would pee and do number two. Like every single time I had to pee, I had to do number two. And now it's like I have space. Like sometimes I pee and then I can go do something that. And then, oh, I finally have to go number two. Like I'm not like, oh, okay, I don't have to spend hours in the bathroom anymore. Oh my gosh, it's so awesome.
I'm just gonna breeze through these.
Okay, and what else is better? Just so much is better. I grew too. That's awesome. So, it turned my life around for good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yay! So we have time for maybe just a couple questions. We're going to have everybody coming back in here at 4:30 for the expert Q&A session. So does anyone have some questions for our panel?
I guess just a couple of questions. One, did you guys have severe xanthomas before, and then I guess after the transplant, did they just completely disappear, or?
Yeah. Well, I had severe xanthomas before my transplant. Well, I was put on, oh my gosh, what was it? I think it was Lipitor. It was like an experimental thing. They're like, let's try this and it might get rid of your xanthomas. So Lipitor actually got rid of, most of my xanthomas, but I still had like some knots on my elbows. But yeah, the transplant like got rid of all of that. Yeah. Mhm.
And then I guess just given the success stories of the post-transplant experience, why don't doctors recommend transplants sooner and only wait until the liver's reached an end stage status?
Yeah. Again, I think it's a good question, obviously, because then if you have a liver disease, why you don't just transplant the liver and then get rid of the liver disease, no? Just at once, if you know it's not going to get better. Um, you know, I think in general, you have to look at, there are different issues. One issue, obviously, is on the patient. Again, the liver has some complications. Survival for all comers about 85%. In Alagille syndrome, it's roughly that, 80 or so, depending upon the paper you look at, or 85%. Then there's a 15% mortality for one reason or the other. Then if you have a patient that have a liver disease, Alagille, if the mortality probably not even be that 15% in 5-10 years, it probably been less than that. Then I think that's the part in the patient. Then you have to morbidity, mortality, quality of life. You hear a success story like this, but she was really having a really bad liver disease. But obviously, for that also, there's a story where there were more complications. There's a little bit of rejection in Hannah's story, but nothing bad. But sometimes after transplant, you can have lymphoma. You can have all this other stuff that can happen. Then you have to understand all those things. The other part to it is the availability of organs, which is a reality for all of us. And then if you have someone that has a good probability of being around, even though there are some struggles, but good probability of being around in 5 years that is higher with a transplant, then you want to wait until the time that you really need it, because even if you put her on the person on the list, and you can see here, right here in the panel, the differences. 2 months, 2 years, no? 7 years for the transplant? No, I'm sorry. How long you wait for the transplant?
2 years. I thought it was
2 years is the waiting time. And how long you wait for your transplant?
like I believe 3 or 4 months.
4 months. Okay. Then that is a reflection of probably how sick they were at the time of being listed, you know. And you will get it sooner, but all of a sudden you list someone and still you wait and wait and wait because you have all these other people waiting on the list. Then one score probably was higher than the other. The higher score got transplanted first versus the other score. And sometimes if the score is not quite there, being on the waiting list doesn't really add up anything if you are not at the right time. Then the part of having also that limitation on organ donation or organs available for the patients limit a little bit how you do things. But I think at the end of the day, everything goes back to the patient. You got to look at the patient, how many struggles you're really having, how is the liver disease, because most patients with Alagille nowadays we have a better understanding of the Alagille syndrome, they do not require transplant. They will not require transplant in their lifespan. And the other thing you have to put in perspective is there's any other issue that have to be dealt with before they are eligible for transplant. Like sometimes the heart condition could be part of a problem that have to be addressed before the patient being able to tolerate a surgery or something like that.
So unfortunately, if you could you hold your question for the expert Q&A, and we'll make sure that she gets up first, or she gets her question asked first. We got about 3 minutes left, so I wanted to pass out some feedback forms, and then if you need a quick break, and then we're reassembling back in here at 4:30. Thank you so much to our panel.